Hi there, kiddos. I apologize that this recording is just going to be audio this time. I was having a lot of glitchy issues with the video, so I thought it would be better to just have the audio if nothing else, right? That's what's important while you guys are reading along. So we're going to start with part 1 of 10 Mile Day today. That starts on page 146 in your Reading Street book. So if you need to pause and go to 146, that would be great. Up at the top of 146, we have our question of the week: what challenges do immigrants encounter? And then at the bottom, we have our full title: 10 Mile Day and the Building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So this is a very challenging thing for these immigrants. They're helping build the first railroad that went from sea to shining sea in the United States. That's a tall order, and they worked hard to do it. And this story is written and illustrated by Mary Ann Fraser. That's right under the title. When we go to the next page, 147, at the top we see a map that shows us where they started working at the start of the 10 Mile Day and where they finished by the end of that day. And it's pretty impressive. At the bottom there, we have the genre explanation. This story is an expository text, so it's actually not even a story. It's just a text that tells the story of an event or a series of events that really happened. So as you read, think about how the author arranges the information. How is it organized? And I bet you could guess, because it's one of our focuses this week. All right, so let's go ahead and get on with the story, right? So let's go on to page 148. Before the 1860s, no railway ran all the way across the United States. In fact, there weren't any tracks at all west of Omaha, Nebraska. But in 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act, and the task of joining the coasts by rail began. The Union Pacific team started out building west from Omaha, and the Central Pacific team began in Sacramento, California, and built east. Promontory Summit, Utah, was chosen as their meeting place. When Charles Crocker, the construction boss for the Central Pacific, learned that the Union Pacific had set a record of a little more than 7 miles of track laid in one day, he claimed that his men could lay 10 miles. The president of the Union Pacific said it couldn't be done and offered $10,000 extra to the team if they could succeed. Early in the morning of April 28, 1869, Crocker and James Strobridge, his right-hand man, called for volunteers for the difficult task ahead. Each crew was promised 4 times its normal wages if it could meet the challenge. Nearly all of the team leaders stepped forward. 1,400 of the Central Pacific's best laborers, both Irish and Chinese, were selected out of the almost 5,000 volunteers. At 7 a.m., all eyes rested on Charles Crocker as he steadied his horse beside the grade. The crews knew it would take 16 railroad flat cars to carry everything they needed to lay 2 miles of track. 5 trains, each made up of an engine and 16 flat cars, now waited. Some stood at the end of the rails, and others were parked on the sidings, the tracks built beside the main road. Wooden ties had already been placed along the entire 10-mile route. Everything was set to go. With a sharp command to the bosses, Crocker's arm rose and fell. The hogger, or engineer, on the first train pulled hard on the whistle cord, and a shrill blast pierced the cold, damp morning air. The race had begun. Chinese laborers leaped onto the flat cars of the lead train. The noise was deafening as sledgehammers knocked out the side stakes and rails tumbled to the ground. The clanging of falling iron continued for 8 minutes until the first 16 flat cars were empty. As the supply train was unloaded, 3 men rushed to the end of the rails, what they called the end o' track. The 3 pioneers scrambled ahead to the first loose ties. Then they began lifting, prying, and shoving to center the bare ties on the grade. The emptied train steamed back to the siding, and men hurried to load iron cars with exactly 16 rails and 32 rail joiners, or fish plates, each. A crew of 6 Chinese workers and an Irish boss hopped aboard. To the right of the track, 2 horses were hitched by a long rope to an iron car. With a yell from the boss, the horses lurched against their harnesses and the cars rolled forward on the track. When the iron car reached the end of track, a wooden keg was smashed over the rails. The iron car rumbled ahead as new track was laid, spilling spikes through the open bottom and onto the ground where they could be used. Dust clouds choked the air. With the iron car moving steadily along, 8 Irishmen lay rails just ahead of its rolling wheels. These iron men were Michael Shea, Thomas DeLay, George Elliott, Michael Sullivan, Edward Killeen, Patrick Joyce, Michael Kennedy, and Fred McNamara. The 4 forward men seized the 560-pound, 30-foot-long rails, while the 4 rear men slid the rails to the rollers on each side of the iron car. The lead ironmen ran forward. "Down!" shouted the foreman. With a loud thud, the iron hit the ties within inches of the previous rail. Without a moment to rest, the 8 ironmen went back for more. On average, 2 rails were laid every 20 seconds. While rails clanked to the ground, the Chinese crew from the iron car loaded fish plates, nuts, and bolts into baskets attached to poles slung over their shoulders. Then they sped up the line, tossing out ironware every 10 yards. Where the rail ends met, another team fastened the fish plates loosely with nuts and thrusting bolts. When each handcar was unloaded, the horses were detached from the front and hitched to the back. At a gallop, they hauled the empty iron car back to the supply dump. If a returning car got in the way of a full iron car, the empty one was flipped off the track until the full car passed. Nothing slowed the flow of supplies to the endo track. After a track gauge team measured the rails to ensure they were exactly 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches apart, the New American and British Standard, the rail ends were loosely fastened with fish plates. Next came the spike setters. Each man picked up one of the spikes lying scattered beside the roadbed and then quickly set it in position with 2 hits. Another gang of Chinese followed. With 3 blows from the maul, each spike was driven home, securing the rails to the ties. Some crews had marvelous names. Fish plate men tightened the nuts on the thrusting bolts with long-handled wrenches. Gandy dancers, or track liners, aligned the rails to the ties using massive track bars. A foreman would sing out a simple tune with a strong beat. Like the crew on a rowboat, the Gandy dancers would all push together on the final beat, aligning the rails. Following close on their heels, a surveyor directed a rail gang that lifted the ties and shoveled dirt under them to keep the track level. The last and largest special work team included 400 tampers and shovelers. They used crowbars, shovels, and tamping bars to pack the ground around the rails. The crew formed 3 long lines, one on each side of the track and one down the middle. Each tamper gave 2 crunching tamps to the gravel or ballast before moving on, while shovelers filled in where needed. From the first pioneer to the last tamper ran a line of men nearly 2 miles long. Like a mammoth machine with hundreds of well-oiled parts, Crocker's men moved rhythmically forward. The ribbon of track rose across the plain at the pace of a walking man. Tired workers were pulled from the line and replaced, but many, including the 8 iron men, showed no signs of quitting. All right, that's a lot of work, huh? All right, that's going to be our day 1. Make sure and open the link below to do your Kami questions if you haven't started already. Good job. See you later.